things I want to talk about.
That's so millennial of you.
I have to adjust my camera there if where it is, so you can't see it. But I have this long, because I'm in a condo, this long tube that we had this like a green kind of grass carpet for the patio. You probably know what it's talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
So we rolled out, but this tube was in the middle of it. But I'm in a condo with a tiny little garbage chute. I've got nowhere to put it, so it's stuck behind this door here. It's been there since May, and my wife has been bugging me to do something with it. And it's so long it doesn't even fit in the back of my pickup. So I needed to adjust the camera so you don't see it poking out from behind the door.
Well, with that, hey, we're live, so let's
Nice.
kick this off. We've had David on before recently. He was our September presenter, and as his new book is published, it also presents a natural extension of the previous topic where we talked about the Métis and the foundations of Manitoba. So we will put in the video description David's biography and maybe a little more information there, but otherwise, let's turn it straight over to you, Dave.
Well, hey, thanks very much. And thanks, Tom and Chris, once again for having me on, especially at last minute like this. I know I just kind of dropped an email to you a couple of weeks ago, so I appreciate your flexibility and making the time for me here. And it is great to be back here. I think we'll be covering a lot of the same ground that I covered when we chatted last time, but the difference being now I have a book out on the subject. And as you can see from the screen there, that's the book we're talking about. Citizen, Settler, Soldier, Scoundrel, A Social History of the Militia of Manitoba from 1870 to 1885. Understandably, kind of a niche topic, but it was something that really interested me. Before I launch into it, I'll just give a very quick background about what brought me to this. And I had started I always had this passion for the story of the creation of Manitoba, and I got very interested in the history of early Manitoba. And I was initially very interested with the story of the Wolseley expedition, also known as the Red River Expeditionary Force, so the first River Expeditionary Force. And I thought, well, that's pretty amazing that 800 Canadian soldiers were just kind of for lack of a better term, parachuted, although they didn't parachute, but they inserted into a small, isolated community. And I started thinking, well, what would have happened if you had done that? Because at the time, the Red River settlement, before it was known as Winnipeg, was extremely isolated. There were three ways that you could get there. You could either take the river route from the Hudson's Bay, you could take the river route that left what is now Thunder Bay and followed the same fur trade route that the Northwest Company used throughout what's now northwestern Ontario, or you could somehow make your way to North Dakota and take a cart trail 400 miles north to Fort Garry. So that isolation meant that it developed an ecosystem unique unto it. And as we discussed during my last chat, the people of the Northwest that you saw that were there at the time, although not exclusively, were predominantly Métis, which were a people now recognized as an Indigenous people of Canada that developed their own customs, traditions, and their own kind of environment in the area. So I got thinking, well, what would happen if you took 800 Canadian soldiers from Ontario and Quebec and just kind of dropped them into this society? And that led to the research, which led to this book. And as you can see from the title, the soldiers that ended up there, they were citizens, settlers, soldiers, and scoundrels. And we'll talk about how they influenced the let's call it the social cultural evolution of Manitoba in the early years, and for good and bad. And there's plenty of bad. And as I say in my book, this isn't a hagiography of the soldiers. There is plenty of nefarious things to talk about in their treatment of the local inhabitants, but we'll get to that. So a quick review of the agenda. When you'll see, I made strong use of the letter S. So I had to fit a few words in there to keep consistent. So the strategy, soldiers, security, society, symbolism, skullduggery, and suppression are each a chapter in my book. and I cover all of these different aspects and what it meant to the social history of the militia in Manitoba during that time frame. So I thought it would just kind of, the alliteration would be good. I had to kind of shoehorn something in there. So skullduggery, I had to come up with that word from older English to fit it in there. But you'll understand when we get to that section. So what I'm going to focus on over the next 45 minutes to an hour are those chapters. And of course, I'll just touch on the wave tops and encourage everybody to get the book for themselves and dig a little bit more deeper. But let's bash on. So by way of introduction, as I said, in 1870, what is now Manitoba was a vibrant, predominantly Francophone Roman Catholic Métis society with an economy centered on the bison fur trade. By 1885, however, the province had dramatically shifted, morphing into a predominantly Anglophone Protestant society with Ontario's agricultural economy transplanted to its prairies. So in just those 15 years, the changes that happened in Manitoba were immense. And we know that Manitoba went from being, at the time, part of Rupert's Land, and in 1870 joining Canada in Confederation after the Red River Resistance. But what we saw overall that in those 15 years was A, the impact of the Canadian militia that were there, and B, the impact of a wave of settlement from predominantly Ontario, also Great Britain, and to a lesser extent, Quebec and some of the other regions, and the United States. So I asked myself the question, as I referred to earlier, what role did the Canadian militia play in this massive change? So before we go too far and start answering that question and what impact they had, I want to talk about what the strategy was. When we talked about the Red River Resistance a few weeks ago, we talked about how Canada saw itself as a key key link in the global British imperial chain that went around the world. It also saw the Northwest as its birthright, something that it was naturally going to eventually absorb. So to recap very, very briefly, it started in 1869. The Canadian government entered into negotiations with the Hudson's Bay Company, who at the time, from a British perspective, obviously not from a Métis or First Nations perspective, controlled the continental interior, which is known as Rupert's Land. Canada entered into negotiations with the Hudson's Bay Company and Great Britain to annex the continental interior. And this led us to what we'll discuss in a short time period, the Red River Resistance. But to go ahead a little bit, once that was resolved and the continental interior was annexed by Canada with the Manitoba Act of 1870, that mentality still existed. And I think it's perfectly encapsulated in the quote I have here, which I share. So the Governor General in 1877, Lord Dufferin, made a trip out to the west, and he took the railway through the United States, and then took a steamship up the Red River, eventually arriving at Fort Garry. But before he arrived there, when he returned to British soil or Canadian soil, however you want to see it, he landed at this town of Emerson. If you're not familiar with Emerson, it's a small town that's right on the border with the United States, right on the 49th parallel. So, of course, that was his entry into Manitoba. And it was quite a big deal that the Governor General had made this trek with his wife and his daughter and a whole coterie of advisors and assistants and whatnot in this visit to see the Northwest. So the Emerson, Manitoba Welcoming Committee produced an address, as they did in the 19th century, and the Governor General stepped off, and the spokesman said, "We feel proud, sir, of the mission which, as Canadians and British subjects, devolves upon us to occupy, possess, and mold the future of this vast territory." And I think that single statement really encapsulates the zeitgeist of the Canadians in the Northwest at the time, specifically, especially those who had recently arrived from Ontario, that they saw the Northwest as a territory that they were to occupy, possess, and mold. And by mold, we mean to settle it and to turn it into an agrarian economy and use it as part of the global British economy. So when we talk about strategy, the government of Canada's grand strategy as it pertains to the Northwest, this statement I feel really demonstrates not just the official strategy of the government, but also the feelings of the people that were there and what they saw their role as settlers in the Northwest to be. So we now need to talk a little bit about soldiers, because the Canadian military of 1870 and up to 1885 was substantially different from the Canadian military that we have now. At the time, still being a colony, more or less, of Great Britain, the overall command and control was exercised by British officers. And we'll talk a little bit more about who they were shortly. There was no regular force, no permanent force of Canadian military at all. They only had an active militia, which were the enlisted and trained folks, very, very similar to what we have as an Army Reserve now, only not quite as, I would say, robust, professional, and I'll say official. One could join the active militia just with the signature of a pen and kind of come and go. They trained infrequently. At the most, they might gather at what they would call their corps headquarters every couple of weeks, and then if they were lucky, there was money in the coffers to afford a camp in the summer. There was also a reserve militia. So the concept in 1870 was that every able-bodied man was responsible or had an obligation to serve his country in time of emergency. So the reserve militia was liable to levy en masse in the event of an emergency. Essentially, every healthy male over a certain age was enrolled in the reserve militia. They did not have to drill, they did not have to train, but their names were on a roster. There were a few exceptions. I won't go through the complete list, but for example, magistrates, prison guards, or widowers, they were all exempt from this. However, if you were a single 22-year-old, you weren't a member of the active militia, you were enrolled in the reserve militia and liable to be raised in the event of an invasion. So let's talk a little bit about how it was organized for the first few years of the time period that we're discussing. So the overall command of any British or Canadian forces in North America was vested in the general officer commanding the British forces in North America, who was rank of lieutenant general. Now, he had maybe not a direct line of command over the adjutant general of the Canadian militia, who was a colonel, but being the senior officer, and the Canadians often deferring to their British superiors in rank, I should just add, he would just be the de facto head of all the military in Canada at the time. But as you see there was also a full-time permanent colonel, a British officer, who was the adjutant general of the Canadian militia. So that was essentially, and he had a small staff, and he was located in Ottawa. So that would be the closest that we would come to a kind of chief of defense staff at that time. The Canadian militia was divided into 9 military districts, and you can see them there. I won't read them out, but these were military districts into which active militia corps were located. So a militia corps would be the same today as a unit. So if you take any unit from the Army Reserve now, let's just say the Queen's York Rangers or the Queen's Own Rifles, that would be considered or be referred to as a corps, an active militia corps in 1869, 1870. These military districts were commanded by deputy adjutants general of the military districts, and they were ranked at lieutenant colonel. So as you can see in this slide, there were 9 military districts at the start of the time period in which we find ourselves. Eventually, however, a 10th military district was added, military district number 10, once Manitoba was brought into Confederation. And we'll go through that a little bit more as we proceed. And again, active militia corps were created in Winnipeg, which we'll touch on. And for the period of 1874 to 1885, you'll see that there were 10 military districts spread across the country. And the general officer commanding British forces in North America was replaced, well, not replaced overall, but replaced in his role, but the general officer commanding the Canadian militia, who is ranked Major General, who is, of course, a British officer. Later, there was a Canadian officer who exercised those duties, but in the main, they were British officers. And the Adjutant General of Canadian Militia, instead of commanding the militia as he may have done previous, the Adjutant General took on a role that was more suitable to the title of Adjutant General, a more administrative role of the actual militia, whereas the General Officer commanding actually did command the Canadian militia. So we touched very briefly on the Red River Resistance, but in order to understand why there were military forces in Manitoba to begin with, I'll just rehash that. As I mentioned previously, there was an attempt to annex the Northwest without consulting any of the inhabitants there. And obviously the inhabitants, led predominantly by Louis Riel, were resistant to being annexed by the Canadians without any consultation. So Louis Riel led a predominantly Métis resistance that eventually produced the Provisional Government of Assiniboia. That provisional government dispatched several emissaries to Ottawa, and under which nation-to-nation negotiations were conducted, which led in 1870, in May of 1870, to the Manitoba Act, which brought the Northwest into the Canadian Confederation and created the province of Manitoba. At the time, a very small, much smaller than is now known as the postage stamp province. However, even though all these negotiations were ongoing, caused to a large degree by the execution of Thomas Scott by Louis Riel, which, if you'll recall, was an incident where a counter-revolution was undertaken, stopped, many of the leaders arrested, and one of them, who was a little bit more bellicose, Thomas Scott, an Orangeman, or an alleged Orangeman from Southern Ontario, was eventually executed. This caused great indignation in Ontario, and even though these negotiations were ongoing, and on the face of it, at any rate, the Dominion government was negotiating in good faith, they nonetheless pursued a military option by dispatching a military force to the Northwest. And that was the perhaps now famous Wolseley expedition. Although it was called the Wolseley Expedition, as you can see there, it's often referred to as the Wolseley Expedition. Its official title was the Red River Expeditionary Force. And even though it was contemplated as a peacekeeping force, there's no denying that within the ranks, there were plenty of people who were not happy with what was going on in Manitoba and seemed to have a grudge or a score to settle with the Métis and with Louis Riel in particular. It was a combined force of regular British and Canadian militia with some support elements. Of course, being a soldier, I have to have an org chart. So there you see, it was a brigade-sized element with a British regular unit, the 1st Battalion 60th Rifles, the King's Royal Rifle Corps. The 1st Ontario Rifles was an ad hoc militia battalion in which volunteers from numerous militia corps in Ontario were brought into this ad hoc rifle battalion. The 2nd Quebec Rifles was very, very similar in Quebec, although they had less verve amongst their volunteers to join the expeditionary force. And it's believed, that many historians have commented, that it's because the people of Quebec had far more, a less bellicose appreciation of what was happening in Fort Garry, and were less interested in sending a military force against what they saw as the Métis, who were predominantly Francophone, and thus their brethren in the Northwest. And of course, G Battery with 4 mountain howitzers. There was also some engineer and some, as you can see in the table on the right, some other support elements there. So as I mentioned, they were drawn from military districts in Ontario and Quebec. They wore rifle green uniforms. Some had no military training at all. When they couldn't find any volunteers, somebody would put their hand up and say, well, we'll train you up on the way out there. And but that was kind of the standard of professionalism that we saw in the Canadian militia of the 1870s. And overall, they were predominantly Protestant Anglophone. Even in the Quebec Rifles, because there was more volunteers from Ontario than there were from Quebec. Depending on the numbers, you hear numbers of anywhere from 70 to 80% of the Second Quebec Rifles were French, while the remainder were English. Up to a quarter of the Second Quebec Rifles were actually Anglophones from Ontario. I'll just pause there if there were any questions or anything I need to clarify before we bash on.
A quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So you had your description of the military structure organization in Canada. You said the Lieutenant General was a British officer, but he had command of the British forces in North America. Was that Canada only, or did his jurisdiction extend to the Caribbean as well?
If I recall correctly, it extended to the Caribbean as well. And of course, it was not just, it was North America, so it was Canada, but it was also Newfoundland and what would become British Columbia as well, because they were all British crown or British territory at the time.
Okay. Yeah, and that's similar to the War of 1812, right? Where
Mhm.
the Governor General was also the senior military officer, and he had British North America, which was not just in Canada, but also Bermuda and then the
Mhm.
Caribbean. So,
Yeah,
okay.
I believe that remained the case well up until the 1870s.
All right, and then more just a fun fact.
Mhm.
Wolseley, based on him being impressed with the voyageurs,
Mhm.
that helped him get, to Winnipeg in this instance, when a future opportunity came for a Nile expedition when they wanted to go to the Sudan and rescue the British official nicknamed Chinese Gordon. So he tried to recruit voyageurs again, but I guess they had largely disappeared, but he had from your area, Ottawa area, a lot of lumberjacks or raftsmen, that were
Mhm.
part of that expedition, and they talked about their extraordinary skill navigating the rapids of the Upper Nile. So,
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up because there were some folks taken from Manitoba for that as well. In fact, we're going to meet one of them in a few slides. Yeah, exactly. Wolseley was he left with a great appreciation after his that route of advance they took, as we'll see here shortly, through northwestern Ontario. He said, "Well, these if I'm going to climb the Nile, then these are probably the folks that can help me do it." All right, we'll bash on. Speaking of which, there it is. So as you know, they were dispatched in early May. They took a steamship from Collingwood, well, train from Toronto to Collingwood, then a steamship from Collingwood to Thunder Bay, and that was the route they took to get to Fort Garry. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but that's essentially how the 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 nucleus of what would become the garrison in Manitoba got to Manitoba. So on August 24th, with the British in the lead and the militia far behind, at least 1 to 2 days behind, the British acting as the vanguard, they arrived and they marched on Fort Garry, and you can see it in the image there what Fort Garry looked like at the time. They took possession of Fort Garry after a bloodless victory. The Union Jack was hoisted, a royal salute fired, and 3 cheers given for the Queen. That was written by Captain Huish, who was one of the I never figured out how to pronounce that name, so I just call him Hoish. I don't know if that's correct or not, but he was one of the company commanders in the expeditionary force, one of the British company commanders, and he wrote a very detailed book about the whole excursion. But there's something to mention here that we will see resonate later on. The By the time they had left, the Manitoba Act had been negotiated, and about the same day that they started moving from Toronto to Collingwood, the Manitoba Act was passed by the Parliament of Canada. So it didn't become law until July 15th, but those negotiations were ongoing. These troops, when they landed, notwithstanding the fact that their government that they were supporting had just negotiated a treaty with the people who were in Fort Garry, they formed up in battle formation, marched on the fort, and amongst many of them, there was hope. They hopefully exclaimed that there was going to be a fight. Wolseley himself had said that he would have liked to have seen Louis Riel hanged. And this was all even knowing that that their own government had negotiated a peace with the people in this fort. So it's that kind of attitude I think we will see resonating a little bit later on. But nonetheless, I like this photo. It's one of the few, well, it's not a photo, so obviously, but it's this drawing, and it's one of the few where you can actually see troops drilling outside of the walls of Fort Garry, because the troops were actually only in Fort Garry for a very brief amount of time in the overall history of the province. So once the troops arrived there, they became known as the Dominion Forces on Service in Manitoba. As I mentioned, they became the nucleus of the permanent garrison that was there from 1870 to 1877. However, there were a total of 4 Red River expeditions, and we'll talk about each one of those very shortly. In 1871, the Governor and Council order to create Military District Number 10 was enacted in Manitoba, specifically in response to a Fenian invasion, and I'll use the air quotes, invasion of Manitoba, which turned out to be more farce than fury. So, as I said, there was actually 4 Red River expeditions. When these troops signed up to join the Red River Expeditionary Force, they would either sign up for 1 or 2 years, and then when their terms of service expired, they would be given the option to settle in the area, or the government would pay for them to go back to the district where they enrolled. And because of the loneliness and the isolation, very few soldiers agreed to actually stay on. Once their terms of service were done, they said, well, that's it for me, I'm going home. So the second Red River Expeditionary Force was sent out in October as reinforcements, because of the original 800, only 89 of the original 800 soldiers chose to remain in Manitoba. Now, mind you, the Adjutant General had determined that there was no need to keep that large a force, but it gives you an idea of how small the force had dwindled to in around 1871, about a year after they had arrived. However, as we'll see, there was a threat of a Fenian invasion, and that caused panic, both in Manitoba and in Ottawa. So another expeditionary force was authorized. You have 275 men from Ontario and Quebec Militia Corps, and they took a very similar route out to Quebec and arrived in October of 1871. That's Thomas Scott. Is a much later photograph. This elderly gentleman certainly did not take that trek in October of 71. He went on to become, I believe, a member of Parliament. That's a much later photo of him. In September of 1872, the third Red River Expeditionary Force was dispatched once again. It was sent in response to the impending end of terms of service of many of the men. It consisted of 100 men from Ontario, 100 men from Quebec, and uniquely, 26 men from B Battery in Quebec City. So if you're not familiar with what B Battery was, in 1871, after the British had decided they were going to take everybody home and they were only going to leave strategic garrisons in Halifax and Esquimalt, the strategically important fortresses in Kingston and Quebec had to be manned by some soldiers. So in October of 1871, the Canadian government created A and B Battery, the first permanent force elements of the Canadian military, and I would imagine be the first elements of what would eventually become a professional Canadian Army. Just a quick side note that the creation of those units has now been recognized as an event of national historical significance by the Canadian government. They also brought with them 2 more 7-pounder muzzle-loading rifled guns to beef up the firepower in Fort Garry. And the fourth Red River Expeditionary Force came out in 1873. These folks were sent in response to increasing fear about Indigenous violence. We'll see that there was a pervasive fear among settlers of Indigenous First Nation violence, which never really manifested, well, never did manifest at all. But nonetheless, it was pervasive. Quelling those fears was key to enticing settlement out there. So in 1873, 50 men from New Brunswick and 50 men from Nova Scotia were sent out uniquely, as up to this point, it had only been in Ontario and Quebec, and 56 men from A and B batteries with 4 Armstrong 9-pounder field guns, which you see there. So we know about the permanent militia garrison, but as I mentioned previously, they also created the active militia in Manitoba. So in September 1871, the first active militia corps were created in Manitoba. And I won't list all of them, but those are some of the rifle companies that were created. The very next month, in response to the Fenian threat, more corps were created, and you see them there. And the man you see there, Lieutenant Colonel William Nassau Kennedy, he was a prominent member of the active militia. He was also the city mayor, and he actually participated in the 1885 Nile expedition. So he was one of the folks that was drawn out because there were a few actual militia officers that were sent out by Canada to kind of provide a degree of command and control over the voyageurs that did get hired to support Wolseley on that operation. I'll highlight there, as I'm a proud gunner, that the Winnipeg Field Battery, that battery still exists. It is 13th bracket Winnipeg Field Battery, which is a battery of 26th Field Regiment, which is headquartered in Brandon, Manitoba. The battery itself, despite having the name Winnipeg in its title, is located in Portersville Prairie. So life wasn't great in Fort Garry. As one of the members of the third expedition, Private Justice Griffin, wrote, "Life was the same dreary round of duties and few changes of scenery and few incidents to interest and occupy the mind, the arrival of mails from home being the only interesting event perhaps for weeks." So it was very cold and a very boring existence for young men. And sadly, as you can see on the photo on the left, when they had idle hands are the devil's playthings, so there was plenty of saloons that they could frequent, and unfortunately that has had a very negative ramifications on the force. So in talking about what they actually provided in how the militia contributed to the social cultural evolution, let's talk about security. So in order to entice settlement into the area, there had to be a secure base from which to do that. If there was any threat of invasions, any threat of indigenous violence, it would be a detriment to enticing settlers to settle in the area, which, as we saw, was the overall strategic goal of Canada. So the force that was there, they served as a deterrent to the Americans, although not a very good one with 89 people, but certainly at one point. But at the very least, it was a overt statement that the Canadian government had invested some interest in the area. It was security against perceived indigenous threats, again, to entice settlement. They were used as law and order. So there was very few police forces until the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1874. There was no real police force out in the Northwest that could enact law and order, and also public safety, firefighting, and enforcing quarantines. We talked about the Fenian invasion of October 1871. The Fenians thought they could exploit the racial tensions that were going on in Fort Garry at the time. So General John O'Neill, smarting from his defeat in southern Ontario and Quebec, decided that he'd take an army up to North Dakota and invade Manitoba from there. His army was about 45 to 50 people strong, and that was about it. They crossed the border and ransacked the Hudson's Bay Company post at Pembina, took a little bit too much celebratory drink in so doing, and were almost immediately rounded up by a U.S. cavalry regiment that was nearby and dragged back to the Hooskow and thrown in jail until they sobered up. But that didn't stop the local authorities from printing something like this in the Manitoba Liberal. They were able to repulse the insolent foe and prove to the world that the Manitobans do not lack the patriotism, the love of liberty, and the undaunted courage of which older countries are justly proud. Of course, not a single militiaman in Manitoba saw a single Fenian. They got nowhere near them. They marched out in 2 days in pouring rain, and somebody finally arrived with a sheet of paper saying, "Your enemy is gone. They've been captured by the Americans." And they turned around and marched back into Fort Garry and patted each other on the back for a job well done, having never even laid eyes on a Fenian. But they did provide law and order. So it was a rough and tumble area. There was plenty of riots that broke out when you had a predominantly male population with too many saloons and too much really bad liquor that they could imbibe in, and young unemployed men, many of which were the military, the soldiers. There were all sorts of riots, and there was a lot of partisan violence between political parties at the time. So Sam Steele, the indefatigable Sam Steele that everybody's heard of, everybody who's gone through high school history classes or junior high history classes has probably heard of him. He was actually a private on the Red River Expeditionary Force, and in his book of his life, 40, I can't remember the exact title, I think it was 40 Years in Canada, he recounted a couple experiences he had. One point, he was rushing to subdue a riot, or to join his troops, or his fellow troops to subdue a riot. He was met by 3 hostiles who tried to stop me, but I clubbed my rifle and easily brushed them aside. They were not prepared to try conclusions in that way. Later, and this is a little unsettling, when a mob had tried to set light to a bank, the actual commander gave orders to load weapons. And as he recounted, it seemed at one time that we might have to fire, but fortunately the disturbance was quelled without it, though there were many broken heads. Later in 1872, there were election riots, and these are some drawings of some buildings that were smashed up during these election riots. Essentially, if you own a printing press that was printing, that had a editorial slant not in vogue with your chosen political party, whenever there was an election, you would just smash down the door and smash up the printing press. So at one point, the militia were called out to form a guard around several buildings. And at one point, as the mob was getting close, the order was given, guard turn out, fix bayonets. So they fixed bayonets, and that seemed to be enough to convince the mob to turn around, and at least not to ransack that particular building. And as I mentioned, they also provided a ready-made source of manpower for other emergencies. Whenever there was a fire, of course, there was no fire brigades until the mid-1870s. So in 1873, there was a fire in the Baker, the Archbishop of St. Boniface Palace. In December 1873, the Manitoba Parliament buildings caught fire. In January 1874, there was a fire in Fort Garry. In that particular case, people were so angry with the Hudson's Bay Company, that there were actually civilians who were trying to impede the work of the militia as they tried to put out the fire, seemingly not caring that the fire was slowly moving towards the ammunition magazine that housed several tons of explosive, and would have made quite a mess of things in Fort Garry. But fortunately, wiser heads prevailed. Lieutenant Colonel William Osborne Smith, who's pictured there, he was the first Deputy Adjutant General of Military District 10. He was from Montreal, and he was the Deputy Adjutant General of Military District 5 in Montreal when he was tasked with this. And he came out shortly after that Fenian invasion. But when the Northwest Mounted Police were created, they were having trouble finding a commissioner. So he essentially he was the first commissioner of the Northwest Mounted Police, even though it was in an acting capacity. But and I go into this in more detail in the book, but not enough people realized the important role that he played in both logistically and administratively in setting up the Northwest Mounted Police when they were created. Interestingly, in 1876, there was a smallpox outbreak. So 20% of the garrison was deployed to enforce a quarantine line. And this smallpox outbreak affected several First Nations. And at that point, actually, very heavily affected by it was an Icelandic colony that had formed in what is called the Interlake region. The Interlake region is the kind of isthmus of land between Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba. They had formed a colony there, and the smallpox affected them quite badly. So a quarantine line was deployed to make sure that nobody affected by smallpox actually got into Winnipeg. So moving now to symbolism, the intangible made manifest. This is a great quote, and I have to just move the screen here because I'm covering up my own words. The state is invisible. It must be personified before it can be seen. symbolized before it can be loved. So what Michael Walzer was meaning by that is that the state exists, but it's kind of ephemeral, isn't it? Except in things that actually represent it, whether it's buildings, whether it's signs, whether it's a flag. So from a symbolic perspective, the militia played a very important role making representing Dominion and British authority in the region, which was rather new to anybody who had been living in the Northwest at the time. So what did they do? Well, they provided trappings of empire and dominion. They provided a physical representation of British authority, British and Dominion authority. They added pomp and pageantry to ceremonies. And we'll talk a little bit more detail about their role in the First Nations treaties. So from a ceremonial perspective, they could be used to highlight the connection with the Dominion and the Empire. They provided guards of honor. So when the legislature opened and closed, the militia provided a guard of honor, or they would fire a gun salute, and they would hold parades. They would often march through the streets of Winnipeg in their red tunics. They would hold parades. Sam Steele recounts how their daily routine in the permanent garrison was quite rote, and they would have drill in the morning and drill again in the afternoon. But in the afternoon, it would be conducted in a manner in the manner of a rifle battalion, in which they trot. They don't necessarily walk. They don't march. They trot. They march at the double, as it were, and it would gather quite a few of what he said were the single young ladies of the settlement would come to watch these parades. So the afternoon parade was dubbed the ladies' parades by the soldiers, because they would often have an audience of young ladies watching them go through their drills in the courtyard of Fort Garry, and later Fort Osborne, which was a purpose-built fort for the militia garrison. And again, the guards of honor and the gun salute, they provided a very obvious manifestation of Dominion and Imperial authority. It's interesting, as I mentioned, they started as rifle battalions. So they wore rifle green uniforms. But when the adjutant general at the time, who was a man named Colonel Robertson Ross, visited the Northwest shortly after Manitoba joined Confederation, he was speaking with several First Nations leaders, and they asked him, who are these men in the dark suits? And they had memories of British soldiers who, in the 1850s, had been stationed in Fort Garry, and both upper and lower Fort Garrys. And they remembered British soldiers wearing red jackets. So he immediately ordered that the color of jacket for the militia in Manitoba would be red, so that it provided that connection with the British authority. Again, a lot of words in this, so I won't go through it all. I won't read it line by line, but at least not the top. But the soldiers, pardon me, provided a symbolic presence during First Nations treaties. If you recall, when we discussed the strategy of the Canadian government to the Northwest, it was to open it up to settlement. And one of the first things they needed to do for that was to extinguish First Nations' claim to the territory. And that's why the Dominion government negotiated treaties with the various First Nations throughout the Northwest. It was with the intent of opening it up to settlement. And as we know, and we won't go into here because it's too deep a subject to go into, there's been all sorts of problems with the treaties as they were signed, but most especially in the way that the Canadian government did not live up to their side of the treaties, but I digress. Nonetheless, that was their strategic intent, and they used military troops as a symbolic presence in almost all of the First Nation treaties in the early years. So if you see this map here, Treaty 1 and 2 were signed in July of 1871. At that time, a guard of 40 soldiers, led by Major Irvine, who would later become a superintendent in the Northwest Mounted Police during the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. They traveled to Lower Fort Garry and provided a guard and the symbolic presence at that point. Treaty 3, in fall of 1873, a guard of 75 soldiers were sent to the northwest angle and northwestern what is now northwestern Ontario to accompany the Dominion negotiators for Treaty 3. And in Treaty 4, in August of 1874, a guard of 113 soldiers, along with a 7-pounder cannon, traveled out and participated in those. In Treaty 1 and even in Treaty 4, some of the officers of the force were even signatories of the treaty. You can see their names on the actual treaty. They were witnesses. The excursion out to Treaty 4 in August of 1874 was a very detailed record of I'll use the term campaign, but the march out west was kept at the time, and it was a pretty substantial march from Winnipeg overland, hauling all of your kit and a cannon. At the time, there were no railways in the area, so it was all by foot to Qu'Appelle in what is now Saskatchewan to negotiate and settle Treaty Number 4. So society, mores, customs, and traditions. As I said at the start, there was a unique society that had grown up in the Northwest, a predominantly Francophone Roman Catholic Métis society that had its own mores, customs, and traditions. It had its own music. It had its own kind of way of life. And that was about to change. And you can imagine when you take 800 mostly Protestant Anglophone soldiers and plop it into the middle of Manitoba, and then follow it up with thousands of settlers, those mores, customs, and traditions were going to change. So the militia provided a social elite. Officers were often prominent citizens. When you go through the newspapers of the day, they would mention various balls that were had and various galas, and they would always list all the prominent members that were there, and they would always list the ranks of the officers that attended. They introduced concepts such as the club. So the Osborne Smith, who we met earlier, he started a militia institute, which was built on the concept of a club. And if you're not familiar, in Victorian England, the club was something very, very important. And in certain corners of today's society, it's still pursued. But every good gentleman would be on a club. And in fact, there was one joke I found in reading that if 3 British gentlemen were found on a deserted island, the first thing they would do would be to found a club with one as the president, one as the vice president, and one as the treasurer. And so that was they imported that kind of tradition and custom into the Northwest. They also provided public entertainment. So when the British first Battalion 60th Rifles came out on the first Red River Expeditionary Force, they actually brought a band. Now, I know I'm not sure why you would bring a band on that kind of an arduous trek, but they brought a band anyway. And what I didn't mention earlier was the British government was adamant that those British regulars, as soon as they got there, they had to turn around and come back. Sir John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister, was adamant that there had to be a British connection to the expedition. I think to add some legitimacy, specifically in the eyes of the Americans. But the British were adamant they would have to leave. So when the British turned around and left, they left all the band equipment. And if you read, as I did in my research, the history of musical instruments in the Northwest, because it was so isolated and things like pianos were quite heavy and various other things, there wasn't a lot of musical instruments in the Northwest. Of course, there were fiddles because the Métis are known for the Red River Jig and for fiddle music. But the soldiers created bands and theater groups, and they were able to entertain both themselves because, again, they had very few other diversions, but they opened it up to local citizens to attend as well as sports. If you go through the newspaper clippings of Winnipeg in the 1870s, any sports club that was created, there was always a team that represented the garrison. So in many ways, they brought these customs and traditions from Ontario and imposed them or introduced them to the Northwest. And eventually, it just became customs and traditions of the Northwest, although usually with a unique flavor that represented an amalgam of what was all these the social traditions that were extant at the time and the new customs that were brought in by the soldiers and the settlers. And they helped to form the Manitoba Rifle Club. You'll recall that every able-bodied male who was not exempt was subject to the reserve militia and a levy en masse. So rifle clubs in the late 19th century were critical for maintaining some degree of martial training for everyone. So the Dominion Rifle Club is the oldest sporting organization in Canada, and the Manitoba Rifle Club was created shortly after the arrival of the forces with the intent of both allowing the members to maintain their musketry skills, but also to allow just the average citizen to maintain their musketry skills. So in these ways, the social change that happened in Manitoba was brought by the soldiers who imported these traditions and customs from Ontario to the Northwest. Before I go into this, I just want to see if there's any more questions or if there's anything we need to rehash before we go on.
Just looking at public entertainment, you know, and the time period Chris and I are more familiar with is the Napoleonic era, but you had a real tradition within regiments. You know, they, especially the officers, you know, they'd have their own theater troops, like they'd entertain themselves, and sometimes they would do that for the local community. They would host galas or balls. Like in a lot of instances, they brought society to some of these smaller communities, frontier towns. And then I'm not sure if this relates to bands, but you know, in that era, the colonel of the regiment generally sponsored a regimental band. He'd provide the instruments and help supported those soldiers that performed in the band. So that might have been the origins of some of these activities. So it'd be a longstanding British military tradition.
Oh, it certainly was. And in my research, I found exactly what you said. The initial theater groups or dramatic societies or bands that were created were to entertain themselves. Again, for at least a year, you had 800 soldiers there with nothing to do, and there were a number of references to this being a British tradition that they would form these theatrical groups or dramatic societies or what have you. But you're absolutely right about the bands. I was amazed going through some of the newspaper clippings, the number of advertisements I saw for a ball to be held here, or there would be the skating rink was going to be open. This was later, of course. The skating rink was going to be open, and almost inevitably there would be an addition at the bottom saying, with music furnished by the band of the Winnipeg Field Battery by the kind permission of the commanding officer. And it seemed like that. You're absolutely right. They were often parceled out in that manner, and I go into this quite a bit in the book to provide that. So, and you hit the nail on the head. You said when these British garrisons would bring society or their version of it to wherever they happen to be. And that's exactly the point I'm making here, is that in many ways, the garrison, the Canadian militia garrison in Fort Garry, can be seen as a colonial garrison, just in the same way that British colonial garrisons were kept throughout their colonies around the world.
So, and then when you talk about clubs, I'm curious, was something like the Masonic Order part of that? Like that would, there was a strong tradition within the British officers' corps, especially amongst the Protestants. I'm just wondering if that would have been established there too.
They did, and in fact, that's going to lead us perfectly into the next section, because what became very prominent was the Orange Order in Manitoba. And if you're not familiar with the Orange Order, it is a Protestant organization that is very, or at least in the 19th century, it was very virulent in its, let's just say, hatred or opposition to anything that wasn't British and Protestant. And it motivated a lot of the violence we're going to see a little bit forward. But there were certainly other clubs that were formed, but the Manitoba Club, which still exists to this day, is a very prominent societal club in Winnipeg. And Osborne Smith, William Osborne Smith, who we met earlier, he was one of the founding members of the Manitoba Club. So that's a great point that they did. It wasn't just the Militia Institute and maybe the Manitoba Club, but there were other smaller clubs that they were certainly members of. And it did. And we're not just limited to the permanent garrison that was there from 1870 to 1877. As you see, Kennedy here and other prominent members, as I say at the top there, almost all officers of the active militia corps were prominent citizens. When you look at some of them, they would go on to be mayors or even the premier or the lieutenant governor of the province. And you had to, because there was no Canadian Forces recruiting group at the time. There was, every commanding officer was responsible for recruiting his own troops. So he had to be a prominent social person to attract those people. And of course, if you didn't have troops, your corps would be stricken from the rolls, and you would be socially embarrassed. So yeah, very, very good point.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So what can't go unmentioned is the insolence and insubordination and intimidation that occurred. As I mentioned, 800 of these soldiers, well, with these 800 soldiers, the vast majority coming from Ontario, being Anglophone Protestants, many of them had a grudge to bear. And as well, many of them were young and arrived into a isolated society where there was, or location where there was nothing to do, but plenty of alcohol to drink. So we're going to look at two things, basically: men behaving badly, just some ill discipline amongst the ranks, and far more insidious, the process of intimidation. So the Manitoba and the Northwest Herald remarked in October 1873, "We have seen the whole police force when it was at its largest." This was a police force that was finally created by Winnipeg. "Not only threatened, but chased like prairie chickens by a crowd of Wolseley's heroes," referring to the militia garrison. So these soldiers were known to be violent, prone to drunkenness, absence without leave, and being arrested. As you can see, between 1870 upon their arrival and 1873, the incidence of drunkenness, absence without leave, and being arrested by the police escalated dramatically. So as you can imagine, with young men who are getting paid with nothing else to do, idle hands are the devil's playthings, and they would find themselves rioting, getting into fisticuffs, all sorts of chicanerous activity throughout the settlement, or throughout the new province. So insubordination and ill discipline was a real problem amongst the force when they first arrived. And it extended to murder. In August of 1874, we have Winnipeg's first public execution. Corporal Michaud of the artillery, the permanent artillery, originally from Quebec, he was found guilty of murder after a night of drinking. He went out drinking with some friends. As he was stumbling home along Portage Avenue, trying to get back to Fort Osborne, which was where the troops were housed at the time, he bumped into a popular young man who had also been out that night, and eventually stabbed him to death in a fight they had on the street in the middle of the night. And the poor chap bled out in the middle of the street. Michaud was arrested the very next day and was brought before the court within weeks. The wheels of justice turned a lot faster in those days. And the first public execution in Winnipeg was of a permanent militia soldier who had murdered a promising young man by the name of Brown in July of 1874. He was executed in August of 1874. And probably not a record that the militia authorities wanted to keep at the time, that was one of their own, that was the first person executed for murder in Winnipeg. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is a term that came to be used in the early 1870s about the violence and intimidation that was meted out by certain elements, perhaps the majority of the soldiers, against specifically Métis and Francophones in Fort Garry and in Manitoba. Joseph Royal noticed this, and he wrote in one periodical at the time that all the evil disorders, the robberies, the personal armed attacks on the highways have had for their authors since the 23rd of August last, the soldiers of the Ontario Battalion. Dr. Frederick Shore wrote his PhD thesis for the University of Manitoba, and he referred to what he called a Kansas-style influx of armed settlers whose purpose was to guarantee that the new province of Manitoba assumed an Ontario image without the interference of the Métis. And that's what he referred to as the process of intimidation. So just a few incidents that were recorded of violence meted out by the soldiers against Métis and Francophones. In August of 1870, a soldier shot at a Catholic priest and assaulted a Métis citizen. In November 1870, 15 soldiers tied a rope around a man's neck and dragged him 100 feet before being stopped. They claimed revenge for Thomas Scott. In February of 1871, a group of soldiers smashed a pro-Métis newspaper office crying, "Death to the Pope, death to Catholics, death to the half-breeds." Again, in February 1871, a riot of 150 militiamen occurred to release an incarcerated soldier. In December 1871, a group of discharged soldiers burst into Riel's home, claiming to have a warrant for his arrest. He was not home at the moment, so they threatened the women by holding guns to their heads and demanding to know his whereabouts. And then the murder of Elzier Goulet, and you see a picture of him there. Elzier Goulet was one of Riel's lieutenants during the Red River Resistance. He stayed in Winnipeg. By this point, by the mid-1870s, many Métis had just decided that it wasn't worth the violence, and they picked up and they moved west into the north, into what is now Saskatchewan and Alberta. Goulet decided to stay. He he was hired by a journalist from Toronto to give a tour of the city of Winnipeg. He crossed over into Winnipeg. So if you're not familiar with Winnipeg, St. Boniface is a neighborhood, the French neighborhood that is on the east side of the Red River, while Winnipeg proper is on the west side of the Red River. He crossed over and was recognized and was set after, or a mob chased him, and he attempted to swim the Red River to get back to St. Boniface to evade them. Reports are that there were numerous soldiers that were in the crowd. People started throwing rocks at him as he swam, eventually striking him, and he drowned in the Red River. And nobody was ever brought to justice for his murder. But that's just one striking example of some of the violence that was meted out against the Métis in this. And that process of intimidation directly led to the next section on the suppression of the Northwest Rebellion, because as I mentioned, many of the Métis thought it was in their best interest to pick up and resettle in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Suppression, the Northwest Rebellion. So the final chapter in the book is on the Northwest Rebellion. I won't go into great detail here about what caused it. It's obviously a very emotional and detailed question. But to sum it up in one bullet point, intransigence and double dealing by the Dominion led Métis and First Nations to rise up in arms in 1885. And Canada responded with the deployment of the Northwest Field Force. We often focus on the Northwest Field Force. Actually, at Staff College, I wrote my directed research product on the comprehensive approach to the Northwest Rebellion, and actually the diplomacy and other means that the government used to put an end to it, not least of which was many of the complaints that people or the Métis and the First Nations had in the Northwest, specifically the hoarding of food supplies and various other things. In order to help quell the rebellion, MacDonald turned those loose to kind of eliminate the complaint, so to speak. but they nonetheless, Canada deployed the Northwest Field Force to respond in a military manner. And eventually the rebellion was suppressed, sadly, with loss of life at the end of a bayonet and with the use of a musket. It's unfortunate that it came to this, but it is what it is. The focus I draw, though, is that from Manitoba's perspective, whereas if you were living in Toronto, the Northwest Rebellion was almost on another planet. In Manitoba, it was right next door. So there was a great deal of concern and panic amongst inhabitants of Manitoba that this rebellion would spread to their locales. By this point in 1885, the cultural change of Manitoba was complete. Due to the wave of settlement from Ontario and Great Britain and the exodus of Métis to the Northwest, the cultural makeup of Manitoba had changed completely. At the time, Manitoba's population was only 1.5% of Canada's total. However, of the 4,500 soldiers that were in the Northwest Field Force, 27%, or 1,217, were raised in Manitoba. Of the killed and wounded soldiers, 42% and 31% respectively were from Manitoba-based units. And of course, Winnipeg formed the strategic and logistical hub. So the focus of my suppression chapter, although I do talk about the operational execution of the Northwest Field Force and the various battles that they had against the Métis defenders, the focus of my chapter is on what this meant to Manitoba, because it was right in their backyard. And as you can see from these stats, Manitoba played an outsized role in the actual rebellion. So, in conclusion, too often the militiamen in Manitoba are regarded as one-dimensionally, and their influence on the social cultural evolution of Manitoba in the Northwest is marginalized or outright ignored. However, these men had far broader cultural influence than the prevailing narrative allows. They were citizens, settlers, soldiers, and scoundrels whose impact went far beyond the barracks and the battlefields. Like the throngs of British settlers from the East who installed their familiar political, economic, religious, and social practices and institutions on their new home, for good or ill, the militia enabled the cultural transmogrification of Manitoba. And thus ends my presentation, and that is a neat summation of my book, but I encourage everybody to go to Amazon. I want to thank Double Dagger Books for publishing this, and hopefully people will pick it up, because in my research anyway, I haven't seen any real investigation into how a militia garrison had that level of impact onto a cultural transformation of an entire society. And that's what interested in me, and that's what I tried to prove in my book. So thank you very much for the time once again, and I'm happy to take any other questions that might be there.
I've been hogging the question dynamic. So, but it's kind of funny, or strikes me as odd, calling it Manitoba militia, where it seems a lot of the period it was Ontario militia that were deployed in Manitoba. Like they're almost like an occupying force. Like,
yeah, you're absolutely right. They certainly were, and I would say it's far more accurate to call them a colonial outpost of the Dominion. And the actual title says the Militia of Manitoba, which I probably could have chosen. Maybe if we had said Militia in Manitoba or the Canadian Militia in Manitoba, it might have been a little bit clearer. But you're absolutely right. Of the period that we look at, the permanent garrison was there till 1877, and the active militia was extant from 1871 to 1885. So after a point, the only military force between, well, essentially, Thunder Bay and the Rocky Mountains were the active militia troops that were in Manitoba.
but then it kind of reflects Canada, right? You had the British withdrawal of their garrisons from Canada, and then Canada was trying to come to terms with what its military would look like, right?
Exactly.
Could it be these militias? Is that enough? Did it need a standing army like that? They'd be wrestling with that for a little while. So,
and certainly for the first number of years, they they had a similar aversion to a regular standing army as the British had originally. So even I know there was a great debate with the creation of A and B batteries in 1871, and if you look at the some of the debates in the House of Commons around that was one of the arguments people were putting forth, that we don't need a permanent force, because there was in British societies anyway at the time, there were in British colonial societies there was a real fear of standing armies. So that's certainly was a significant debate of the time period.
And then I'll ask one more, and then I'll turn Chris loose with his questions. But did any of this Ontario battalion, did they get land grants, or some of them, after spending a period of time, decided they wanted to settle in Manitoba? Like, did that kind of prompt a wave of immigration, from the east, so to speak?
I wouldn't call it a wave. Some certainly did. So part of the the way to lure people to join, especially in the second, third, and fourth expeditions that came out to reinforce the original one, was to offer a land grant. So every soldier was given a quarter section of land once their terms of service had been complete. The vast majority of them, however, sold them and went home because they didn't have to settle. They were encouraged to, but many of them sold them and then went home because there was a large number of settlers that were coming in that weren't soldiers, but were looking to buy up land, these land titles that these soldiers had. And I think after a year in that isolated post that they enjoyed, unless they had found, or unless they had decided they wanted to settle, or if they had found a young lady who had kept them in the region, the vast majority, and depending on the year, it was anywhere from I would say 60 to 80% chose to go home rather than settle in Manitoba.
Okay, thanks. Oh, Chris, you gotta flip your thing down again.
Thank you. So believe it or not, I don't actually have any questions tonight. There were a number of people who joined us on the live stream, but no questions popped up that I saw. So maybe I will just wrap up quickly and ask you to kind of reiterate the best way to get a hold of your book if people are interested.
Certainly, it's published by Double Dagger Books. Right now, it's available on Amazon. And as we slowly work through this, we're going to see if we'll find any stores to carry it. But the easiest way for everybody to get it is to look it up on Amazon. It's available in paperback and on Kindle.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll try to look up that listing and add it to the video description as well. So
excellent.
All right. And then a fun fact, I scrambled to look up a book I had here on the militia of Waterloo County. So during the 19th century. So as you know, I got an affiliation with the Royal Highland Fusiliers of Canada. So the Galt Rifle Company, and then a number of local communities had rifle companies that went on to be the 29th Battalion or Waterloo Battalion. So they had 9 or 10 men join the Ontario Rifles as part of the Red River expedition. So I found a local connection. So
yeah. Excellent. Yeah, it's funny, and some of the personalities there, like Sam Steele was in there, and then when you study especially the history of the Northwest, because some of the folks from the original expedition did stay, and like I said, Irvine, who would go on to be a superintendent in the Northwest Mounted Police and play a major role in the Northwest Rebellion, and others. Those names kind of resonate, and it's funny, they all kind of originated in the Wolseley expedition.
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone knows Sam Steele as much as you assume. Like, it's just, I remember reading a biography and I was dumbfounded by everything this man was involved with, but even right down to who his father was, who I think was a Royal Navy officer, settled in the Orillia area, I think. So it's a future to do. We got to get someone to speak on Sam Steele. I think that'd be a great.
I guess being older than probably many of your viewers, I do remember we talked extensively about Sam Steele in junior high, not extensively, but we certainly touched on him, and maybe even elementary school. but he does have a heritage minute. So I think that's that's an indication that he is a pretty important, or a pretty, at least a pretty relevant historical figure in Canadian history.
Oh, a huge one. It just the aspects of Canadian history that he was involved with, right? So
yeah, for sure.
all right. Well, I'm going to stop the live stream. Thank you for those that joined us live. It's sort of a spontaneous thing. We decided instead of recording to a computer, we just go ahead and live stream this. But the full recording, well, was up now, but we'll tidy it up a little bit too and get that out there. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom and Chris. I really appreciate it. And once again, thanks for your flexibility. I know this was a last minute request, but I do appreciate it. And hopefully everybody had learned something and